If I just say the word gospel, you probably have some kind of reaction to it. This word gospel becomes a kind of shorthand, like when somebody says they were really preaching the gospel this morning at church. There's an assumption that that's going to mean something to the person that they're talking to. And different people, different groups have different assumptions about the content of the gospel. And I don't mean the gospels, the stories about Jesus, but I mean the good news that Jesus and the apostles were preaching. And although it may seem obvious in our culture, which is so steeped in Christianity that everybody knows what Jesus said, that different people have different takeaways, that there are some that focus on the need to be perfect. There are some that focus on the need to be forgiven. There are some that focus on the need to establish a kingdom. There are some that focus on the need to attend to the needs of the poor. And in an era where Christianity is talked about a lot in the public square, it's had me thinking about our assumptions about the gospel. What is the gospel? What is not the gospel? I, in my typical fashion of wanting to question and test everything, am embarking on this journey of going back to the original text, going back to the Gospels to see what's on the page, to see if there are differences that need to be worked out interpretively, and to come to at least my own understanding of what the gospel is without just moving forward with someone else's assumption of what the gospel is. So today, I'm going to pull back the camera and look at these vessels that deliver the gospel message, namely the gospels that made it into the Christian New Testament. The gospel of Matthew, the gospel of Mark, the gospel of Luke, and the gospel of John. So hang on, that's what we're covering today. This is Faith Still Seeking, a program about Christian theology. I believe, but I want to know more. I'm not a minister, I'm not a PhD, I'm just a layman, and I'm doing theology. Yeah, I definitely don't have it all figured out, but it's never stopped me from trying. Hello, and welcome back to Faith Still Seeking. I'm your host, Kelly. I'm a Christian writer and commentator, and I write about faith and history and theology and culture, and occasionally get a little bit political, a tiny bit. All right, so back to the Gospels. What are the Gospels? Kelly, what are the Gospels? So at their most basic, these are 4 different books, distinct books, which tell the story of the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was, you probably know who Jesus was, but in case you don't, he was a holy man from Galilee who was executed by the Romans in Jerusalem in the 1st century. Oh, just a note. This podcast is not going to explore whether Jesus was an actual historical figure or not. I know there are some people who dispute that. I'm going to work with the assumption that Jesus was an actual historical figure who was a teacher, who had followers, who was noted not only in Christian literature, but in Jewish literature of the time, Roman literature of the time, alluded to the existence of this person. I believe there's enough historical evidence, and it's spare. It's not super detailed, but there's enough evidence to at least establish that there was this man who walked the earth at that time, was killed under Pontius Pilate, etc. Some of the historical sources that support that are sources that would have been antagonistic to Christians. They had no reason to talk about Christians unless this was a real thing. So this is not where we're going to talk about Jesus just being copied from Greek or Egyptian religion or being a hallucinogenic mushroom. That's another podcast. So back to the Gospels. Back to you, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So who wrote the Gospels? Church tradition has these books written by 4 individuals known as the 4 evangelists. That's St. Matthew, St. Mark, St. Luke, and St. John. However, some scholars say that the texts themselves of the Gospels are anonymous and are not viewed as eyewitness accounts. That the ascriptions of who wrote these Gospels, like this Gospels according to Matthew, come from outside the Gospels, not within the Gospels themselves. Similar to other existing kind of biographical literature at the time, the author doesn't announce the author's self in the text. The Gospels are written sort of like they're eyewitness accounts, and that makes a lot of sense in the context of Jesus' sermons and conversations among the apostles. It's written like somebody was there. When they take on kind of an omniscient narrator point of view, that they were also in the barn where Jesus was laying in the manger when people came and brought him gifts, and they were in Egypt as the Holy Family fled for their safety, then it's clear that they're not completely eyewitness accounts. However, scholars are not saying that these reports were made up completely out of whole cloth. They're saying that when these were committed to writing, which happened decades after the life of Jesus, that in the meantime, these stories had been passed around as oral traditions that were shared among the earliest followers of Jesus in those few decades. On the topic of the oral traditions that fed into the Gospels, let us pause for a moment to talk about the telephone game. You've probably heard about and maybe even played at some point in your life the telephone game. I was introduced to this game in the context of theater classes. It's an interesting lesson in human communication and how it works, because what you do is you get, say, a row of 5 or 6 people, and they're all sitting close enough to each other that they can whisper something to the person next to them. You whisper something to the first person in the line, who then is supposed to memorize what you just said and whisper it to the next person in the line, who then tries to remember what you said and then whisper it to the next person down the line. And frequently what happens is that whatever was said at the beginning ends up having somehow transformed by the time it gets to the end. That either through mishearing, misremembering, that the text will change a little bit. And if somebody hears something and it doesn't quite make sense, their brain may reshape it a little bit so that it makes the kind of sense that they think it does. So, say somebody at the beginning said 77 years ago, by the end, it might transform into 4th down and 10 yards to go, or something that it changed a little bit. I don't know anything about football. I played football very briefly in junior high school, and they used to tell me just to fall on the ball if it got anywhere near me. Thank God I discovered theater. Anyway, the first time in college that I heard this idea that these were oral traditions, I was already unhappy about the Gospels. I did not want them to say what I thought they said. And when I got this glorious news that these were not written by people who maybe even were alive at the same time that Jesus was, and that the stories had been passed down by oral tradition, I thought, okay, I've got the Gospels on the ropes. I knew it. That it's all made up. And even if it wasn't made up, it at least had been some kind of telephone game that originally it was, that Jesus performed CPR on somebody, but then, later it turned into like, oh, we brought him back from the dead. However, I was both disappointed and heartened to know that that's not really the situation that happened with the Gospels. One, that even though these stories weren't committed to writing for quite some time, that they had circulated within a community of believers. There was never a point where it was just simply the work of one really inventive person who said, I'm going to totally make up this story. There are some scholars who think that the attribution of the certain names to the different Gospels came from someplace, that these communities were maybe even started by these evangelists, that there was a preacher named Matthew who told this story, and then there became the community of Matthew who took this story and passed it along, or the community of Mark, or the community of Luke who shared these stories. So it seems like there was some accountability and checks and balances in getting the story right. That's the second point that I came across, is that these communities were committed to getting things right, that memorizing scripture was an important job and active devotion in the ancient world. This wasn't a world where everybody had a bookcase and they could just like pull out their favorite scrolls. Stories were told around the campfire. These epic poems were memorized and told. This is quoting Professor Loveday Alexander in the Cambridge Companion to the Gospels. Alexander notes, ancient teaching methods were heavily focused on the memorization and adaptation of short, pithy tales and adages, from gnomic one-sentence aphorisms to longer and more complex tales focused around the telling word or action of a particular teacher. And Professor Alexander then goes on to draw parallels to Socrates, that Socrates didn't write anything. He taught, and he also, through his lifestyle, gave an example of his teaching. So there isn't a single biography of Socrates, and there certainly isn't a single autobiography of Socrates, but an anecdotal tradition of people who had heard and seen Socrates gathered a kind of critical mass, which then became our understanding of the life and teaching of Socrates. So Professor Alexander and other scholars suggest that a similar thing happened with Jesus, and that for the followers of Jesus, his exact words were pretty important. The getting, even as Jesus said, every jot and tittle, the punctuation that you would see in Hebrew, getting every I dotted and T crossed was an important part of telling the story of Jesus. And you can see this exactitude at work, where some of the quotes and sayings of Jesus, even though they're not necessarily in the same order, are recorded in almost exactly the same language. That somehow capturing this language was really important. And although I noted earlier that by the time people were writing these down, that we're talking like 70 to 100 years after the events, that, a lot of people weren't alive who had been there. But as these stories were circulating, there were certainly people around who had been around during Jesus' life, people who had heard these stories firsthand from their parents, their grandparents. And some of the evidence that we have for that is that the Gospels are not complete hagiography, as they would call it, which is that's the story of a holy person that's just worshipful, that's just everything they did was perfect. That would be great, but that's not what the Gospels are. There are things in the Gospels that are embarrassing to the apostles, who could have intervened and maybe tried to scrub these stories from the record, except that other people knew about these stories and would call somebody out, probably if it was left out of the story. They would realize that this was inauthentic. Some examples of those embarrassing moments include the Apostle Peter denying that he knew Jesus after Jesus was crucified. And Peter went on to lead the church in Rome. And yet here's this story of him doing something really awful and embarrassing in the Gospels. There's a story of two of the apostles vying for who is going to be the greatest in heaven and asking to sit at the right hand of Jesus. This is some pretty egotistical, not self-sacrificing Christian stuff for a couple of guys who then go on to become leaders in this newly burgeoning movement. And yet the story was left in place. There are even some stories that I would say are embarrassing or challenging about Jesus himself. There's a story about Jesus not being able to perform any miracles in his hometown. It's like he goes back for the high school reunion and is like, "Hey, everybody, I'm the Son of God." And they're like, "You're just a son of a carpenter." And their lack of faith actually affects his ability to do anything. Now, if you're telling a story about a person who is supposed to be the all-powerful God, this story might get in the way of that. But people knew this story. And it would have been notable if it had been left out. And there are other moments. There's Jesus telling this Syrophoenician woman that she's a dog. I mean, come on, you didn't have to include that, but somebody maybe remembered it. There's a third point that I would make about the transmission of the Gospels, and this I haven't read this anywhere else. This is kind of my own theory, and it may have some holes in it, but follow me. So, in the Gospels, there are some stories that are ridiculous. There are claims that, given what we know about physics and medicine and the way the world works, that are, let's say, fantastical. And we're talking about miracles and exorcisms and people coming alive from the dead. We're talking about water turning into wine. We're talking about people walking on top of water. We're talking about things like, and this is going into Acts of the Apostles, but we're talking about, like, there was somebody who gets transported from one place, like, to another place, like total science fiction. The Apostle Philip, he did the first teleportation to baptize somebody. It sounds like I'm not making a very good case for it not being made up. Like, you could say, yeah, this all helps support the fact that this was totally made up. And it's very easy to look at people in the first century and to say ancient people were dumb. Ancient people were pre-scientific. They believed in magic. They believed that diseases were caused by spirits and that the weather had to do with whether or not you sacrificed the right kind of thing to God, and if he was mad, he wouldn't rain on your crops. And as not only as post-enlightenment, but post-modern people, it's easy to look back and with our noses in the air and say, well, they didn't understand anything. They didn't understand the world like we do, which I think is maybe overestimating our ability to understand the world. But it also is worth noting that it wasn't like the people in the first century knew nothing. I mean, otherwise they would not have survived. I mean, they knew if you drop something, it's going to fall and hit the earth. They may not have known about gravity and the rate of acceleration, but they knew that if you were walking in the woods, you had to be careful because if you tripped over something, you were going to fall, that somehow the earth attracted you. I believe that they knew things like if you stick your hand in the fire, it's going to hurt and damage your skin. At least after the first person. The first person might not have known, but I believe that they might have told the second person. And I have a feeling that at some point they figured out that if a man and a woman know each other in a certain way, that it makes children. Again, maybe the first one didn't figure it out, but I think eventually they probably did. So it's not like they didn't know anything at all. And I would believe that one of the essential things they might have been able to figure out is that when somebody's dead, that they stay dead, that they don't just wake up from the dead and walk around and eat fish with their buddies. So I say all this to say, if this was a pure invention or even a pure telephone game, that the first time the story took a turn and instead of Jesus was killed and was buried, the first person who introduced, and then on the third day he rose again, I can't imagine that the person listening to them just said, "Oh, okay, that sounds perfectly reasonable. Of course he did." And then went on to tell his family and everybody, "Hey, guess what? This guy rose from the dead." That they would be like, "No, people don't do that." But if there had been some kind of stir, some kind of legend, something that had been circulating in the air already, that this story would get passed along. I'm not trying to get into pure apologetics here, and I'm not trying to proselytize anybody. But whatever happened, if it was a case of mistaken identity or some kind of conspiracy or whatever, something happened. It wasn't just a pure invention. Something happened that got people thinking. But that these things, the fact that it was community, the fact that people were committed to keeping the story intact, these all added up to me saying, okay, it isn't all just made up. Like there's some basis for it. Like there goes my theory that it's all made up. Like something happened to somebody that at least formed the foundation of the story. Okay, so that's enough of that. Now back to our regularly scheduled program. So I've covered what gospel is, talked about who wrote or might have written the gospels. I've alluded to this, but let's talk about timing. Now, from the great biblical scholar, Wikipedia, it says that the gospels were written somewhere between 66 AD or CE, depending on how you, in the Common Era, that they were written 66 years after the birth of Jesus, up to 110 years. And within the text of Wikipedia, as it's been collaborated on by multiple people, the article does point out that this puts the composition of the Gospels likely within the lifetimes of various eyewitnesses. Of course, as with the authorship, there is disagreement about when the Gospels were written, which makes certain theological sense. You would think that the closer the Gospels were written to the actual events, the more that people would believe that the narrative is accurate, and that the further out, the more opportunities there are for faulty memories, imagination, hanky-panky, things to happen. And so more conservative, traditional theologians are going to push for earlier dates, whereas other scholars who are, I guess, less concerned with preserving the historical accuracy of the Gospels push to later dates. And again, the inclusion of stories that are embarrassing, which is called the criteria of embarrassment, that helps support that somebody was around who still knew the original story. And ironically, among scholars who are the most skeptical of the Bible, and I'm talking about people from like the Jesus Seminar, which, again, back to handy Wikipedia, was a group of about 50 biblical criticism scholars and 100 laymen, founded in 1985 by someone named Robert Funk, and originated under the auspices of the West Star Institute. The seminar was very active through the 1980s and 90s and into the early 21st century to decide their collective view of the historicity of the deeds and sayings of Jesus of Nazareth. Like, they really broke out the New Testament verse by verse, and they're like, do you think this happened? Do you think this happened? And their criteria was pretty tough for what they believed and what they didn't believe. So there was a lot of the New Testament that they determined that they could not prove that it was something that Jesus authentically said. However, for them, the more difficult and challenging statements of Jesus were the ones that they thought were the most authentic. And not just the embarrassing stories, but also one of the criteria that they included was irony. Back to Wikipedia. Based on several important narrative parables, such as the parable of the Good Samaritan, the fellows decided that irony, reversal, and frustration of expectations were characteristic of Jesus' style. If a pericope, that's Pericope, which up until a few minutes ago I pronounced pericope until I looked it up on Webster's, but it means a passage of a text, particularly of the Bible. If a pericope presents opposites or impossibilities, it is more likely to be authentic. So ironically, even the skeptics were like, yeah, some of this stuff is probably authentic because it's frustrating. And regardless of the date when they were written, most scholars, even more traditional ones, at least agree on the general order, which is Mark being seen as first, Matthew and Luke in the middle, with Luke also being considered the first half of a two-part story because Luke also wrote Acts. Sometimes they're thought of together as the narrative of Luke Acts. And then John, the more abstract philosophical book, being the last. Okay, so we got the timing. So what's in the Gospels? What you got in those Gospel books? Going back to Professor Loveday Alexander in the Cambridge Companion to the Gospels. And man, I took so much stuff from this article. I'm gonna have to send this guy some royalties if I were making any money off this podcast. So of what's in the Gospels, Professor Alexander says the shape of the story is broadly biographical, tracing the hero, Jesus, tracing the hero's public ministry in a roughly chronological sequence covering 3 years of his life at most, because there's some disagreement about the timing, and culminating in his trial and death. Alexander points out only 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, have birth stories, and neither has much information about his childhood. Alexander also points out that the two birth narratives, although they agree in the names of Jesus' parents and the place of his birth, have little else in common. So we've got broadly biographical story, chronological sequence, covering his life, trial and death. A couple of them have the birth stories. All 4 canonical Gospels, Alexander points out, feature a baptism by John the Baptist, which Alexander says is somehow essential to the story. And some scholars say that John the Baptist was so popular that this particular story of Jesus coming to John and John acknowledging, Jesus, you're greater than me, was a way of elevating this story above the John story. That there was a way of distinguishing and being like, look, even John the Baptist thinks that Jesus is who he says he is. So, moving along, Jesus' baptism by John is the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. And then in all four Gospels, the story is then divided into basically two parts. The first is Jesus' ministry in Galilee, which is traveling around, gathering followers, miracles, exorcisms, and preaching. All the things that he says. And then the second part is the events leading up to his last week and his trial and execution and death in Jerusalem. In describing the four Gospels, Alexander says the ministry is narrated via a loose-knit series of anecdotes of Jesus' actions, many miraculous, but not all, combined with samples of his teaching, parables, sayings, discourses. The episodes are arranged differently so that the order of things is different from gospel to gospel. This difference in arrangement of episodes causes Alexander to note that this suggests the evangelists felt free to exercise a certain amount of individual license in the overall construction of their narratives. And these narratives are gospel. It's its own genre. It's not history per se. This was not, I'm going to give you a scientific account of the day-by-day life of Jesus. This is, I am telling you a theological story that's going to make an impact on your belief in this person. And they're arranged in ways that make sense to those authors. Then it comes to the passion narratives. The final week of Jesus, the trial, the death. Passion meaning, in this context, agony. Not like, oh, we're so passionate about Jesus. Although some of us are. And Alexander notes, in all four Gospels, the last week of Jesus' life occupies a disproportionate amount of narrative space. A quarter of the whole book in Luke and Matthew, and up to a third of the whole book in Mark and John. And then Alexander goes on, he says, all the Gospels agree that Jesus' story does not end with his death. All have descriptions of his disciples and friends visiting the tomb after his death and finding it empty, and all except Mark add stories in which the resurrected Jesus appears to his friends and talks with them. And we'll talk more about that as we get into episodes about the individual Gospels. Looking at all four together, you might say, wait, there are differences? How can they be accurate depictions of this man's life if there are differences? And yes and no. Yes, they all talk broadly about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. There is a lot of commonality, particularly between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are called the synoptic Gospels. You can kind of weave them together into a continuous story. And as Loveday Alexander said in the Cambridge Guide, the four canonical Gospels have many individual characteristics, but they also have a lot in common, so much so that their traditional titles present them as one gospel in four forms. The Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel. So it's as if the Gospel is this one pool or one well, and each of them are taking their portion of it and saying, this is my version of the Gospel, but the Gospel is a unified thing. And the fact that there's so much shared material between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are theories about whether there are other sources that we don't have access to that they borrowed from. So there might be some other source of material that Matthew and Luke took from that was not Mark. There might have been a list of just like Jesus' sayings that was passed around as well. But these are all theoretical. What we have is the evidence of these actual books, and then we can guess where they came from. And there's a whole branches of scholarship that are dedicated to just that. The differences between the Gospels, in some cases, is the same story as told somewhere else, but it's told in a different context. It's told to a different audience. It has a slightly different punchline, but it's the same story. But then there are some other differences that are a little bit more glaring. And even then, some of them are not consequential to the message of the story. There's two different accounts of the death of Judas. One account says that he hanged himself. Another account says that his guts burst open, basically. Oh, this is actually, it's a Matthew and Acts, but Acts is part of Luke. So, Judas's death according to Matthew 27, 1-5. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. Why am I using the voice from Jesus Christ Superstar? I don't know. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. In Acts, it says, with the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called that field in their language Akeldama, that is, the field of blood. I know there's somebody saying he hanged himself, and then the hanging somehow made his intestines burst out. Like that happens. It's not consequential to the story, but these are different. Somebody left out something important from one or the other of these stories. I'm looking, by the way, on the website bartehrman.com. He's a New Testament scholar, and he has a website and blog that has got a lot of really great scholarship on it. And this is a guest article written by Marco Marina, PhD, author, historian, and it's called The Reliability of the Gospels. Are the Gospels historically accurate? And this author points out some of these so-called contradictions. This is a lovely quote. This is within Marina's article, but he's quoting E.P. Sanders, who was one of the original scholars who was involved in the search for the historical Jesus movement. It says, narrative sources come with biases, errors, perspectives, and ideologies. With regards to the Gospels, E.P. Sanders notes, there are no sources that give us the unvarnished truth. The varnish of faith in Jesus covers everything. And I love that idea. Like, clearly it's like syrup that these guys were living in. They were such ardent believers. How could they not have their faith affect their writing? So here's another supposed contradiction, is that, and this is from Ligonier Ministries. I disagree with them on a lot of stuff, but they're so rigorous in their scholarship. It says, close readers of the Gospels understand that John's timeline of the Last Supper seems to differ from the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptics indicate that the disciples prepared the Passover meal on the first day of unleavened bread, or Thursday night. Jesus went out to betray him that evening, and Jesus was arrested in the night. He was then crucified on Friday. He was in the grave until Sunday morning, on which day he was raised from the dead. Yet, John says this after the Last Supper had occurred, when the Jews went to Pilate's headquarters. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. He then later says, after Jesus was crucified, that it was the day of preparation of the Passover. This means that Jesus' arrest and trial would have happened before Passover, unlike in the Synoptics, where Jesus' arrest and trial happened after the Passover. This article then goes to great lengths to try to reconcile these two facts. If you want to read it, read it. To me, it's at its face value, these two narrative accounts seem to contradict each other. Which brings up the question, does that mean it's not true? I pulled this book off my shelf. It's probably been there for 20 years, Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. He was the former legal editor of the Chicago Tribune who supposedly set out to disprove Jesus and ended up finding him. But interweaving a legal case with the story of Jesus, he makes the point that discrepancies in eyewitness accounts don't necessarily mean that they're not accurate, that different people in courtroom disagree about the exact things that happened all the time. Lee Strobel's talking to Craig L. Blomberg, PhD. It says Craig Blomberg is widely considered to be one of the country's foremost authorities on the biographies of Jesus, which are called the Four Gospels. Okay, so here's a test that skeptics often charge the Gospels with failing. After all, aren't they hopelessly contradictory with one another? Aren't there irreconcilable discrepancies among the various Gospel accounts? And if there are, how can anyone trust anything they say? Blomberg acknowledged that there are numerous points at which the Gospels appear to disagree. Quote, these range all the way from very minor variations in wording to the most famous apparent contradictions, he said. My own conviction is, once you allow for the elements of paraphrase, of abridgment, of explanatory additions, of selection, of omission, the Gospels are extremely consistent with each other by ancient standards, which are the only standards by which it's fair to judge them. Ironically, I pointed out, this is Strobel talking, if the Gospels had been identical to each other word for word, this would have raised charges that the authors had conspired among themselves to coordinate their stories in advance, and that would have cast doubt on them. That's right, Blomberg had agreed. If the Gospels were too consistent, that in itself would invalidate them as independent witnesses. People would say, we really only have one testimony that everybody else is just parroting. Then Strobel says, my mind flashed to the words of Simon Greenleaf of Harvard Law School, one of history's most important legal figures, and the author of an influential treatise on evidence. After studying the consistency among the four gospel writers, he offered this evaluation. There is enough of a discrepancy to show that there could have been no previous concert among them, and at the same time, such substantial agreement as to show that they all were independent narrators of the same great transaction. From the perspective of a classical historian, German scholar Hans Stier has concurred that the agreement over basic data and divergence of details suggest credibility because fabricated accounts tend to be fully consistent and harmonized. Every historian, he wrote, is especially skeptical at that moment when an extraordinary happening is only reported in accounts which are completely free of contradictions. However you look at this question of discrepancy, I want to go back to my friend Professor Lovejoy Alexander, who says, whatever way we look at it, the fourfold gospel, recognized and valued by the church from early on, is a significant literary phenomenon in its own right. If the writers of the four Gospels had no contact with each other, the similarities are remarkable. If they did know each other, the differences are remarkable. At one point in my life, I thought that the Gospels were like four different reports from different reporters commenting on the same events. It's kind of like that editorial cartoon where you've got the four students in the classroom and the teacher says, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you need to see me after class. Your reports were awfully similar. But I don't think that it's that anymore. I do tend to believe with this notion that these were four communities within the larger community of the first century church who were dedicated to preserving these traditions and pass them along, and then they were written down. And as many scholars propose, that they're the, as Alexander describes it, the written deposit of the oral tradition about Jesus. I rather like what Marco Marina says on Bart Ehrman's website. He says, the gospel accounts are not mere works of pure myth or fabrications. They are historical documents rooted in the social, religious, and cultural contexts of their time. Yet, like any ancient historical source, they come with inherent limitations, including questions of authorship, transmission, and interpretation. To categorically dismiss the Gospels as wholly unreliable is to overlook the valuable insights they offer. Through careful analysis and critical examination, we can glean a profound understanding of the historical Jesus, a figure whose influence has reverberated through centuries. And so, does any of what we've talked about, the dating of the Gospels, who wrote them, what's in them, diminish them as part of the Word of God? If that means, does it diminish the value of the Gospels as our primary sources of information about Jesus, then no. As for the Word of God, Jesus himself is described as the Logos, the Word of God, not the book in which we read about Jesus. As the Gospel of John says, and I'm going to the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. Then jumping ahead to verse 14, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. So he's making it clear. The Word through which everything was created was Jesus himself, not the scriptures that point to Jesus. However, and to put that into context so that we do not believe that this scholar of theology is diminishing the gospel, I turn to one of my favorite theology books, which is Introduction to Theology by Owen C. Thomas and Ellen K. Wandra, 3rd edition. This is on page 48. The Primacy of Scripture is the subtitle. The general consensus of contemporary theologians is that the theological criterion of true Christian doctrine of what is and what is not a valid part of Christian faith is the revelation of God to which testimony is given in the Bible. So that revelation of God is the true measure of what is and is not Christian faith, but it acknowledges that the Bible, the scriptures as we have received them, is the testimony of that revelation. So this paragraph then goes on to describe differences in different branches of Christian faith and their view on this. Official Roman Catholic and Orthodox theologians hold that tradition ought to be included in this criterion. So they broaden it a little bit. It's not just this pure revelation from God that came down through the scriptures, but also the structures that the church have created around that through tradition. Then they go on to say, fundamentalists and some conservative evangelical theologians affirm the primary authority of Scripture, but reject the historical critical approach that we affirm. So the historical critical method is a branch of criticism that investigates the origins of ancient texts to understand, quote, the world behind the text. The historian applying historical criticism has several goals in mind. One is to understand what the text itself is saying in the context of its own time and place, and as it would have been intended and received by its original audience. The historian also seeks to understand the credibility and reliability of the sources in question, understanding sources as akin to witnesses to the past as opposed to straightforward narrations of it. So the text is regarded as a historical record of the writer's understanding of what was going on. And the historical critical method is trying to figure out what was going on. It understands that writers are not pure Xerox machines, that there's always interpretation and perception through which these things are filtered. So historical critical method says, here's the text. It's the record of something else that happened. It's not an exact history of what happened. Anyway, back to this text. The aim of theology is to express the reality of God and God's relation to the world. But the only way we can know anything about the reality of God and God's relation to the world is in divine revelation. There's a whole other chapter where they talk about that like you can't scientifically measure God using a microscope or telescope or a scale. It's divine revelation is the only way that you get to know about God. So the ultimate norm of theology, the ultimate standard by which you would measure theology, is God's revelation. But we do not have this revelation in itself. There's some people who might be like, I got the revelation. Great, you're a prophet. Awesome. But what these authors are saying is the revelation that we have about the God of Christianity comes through the people who wrote these scriptures. And so it says here in the text, we know of this revelation in the first instance only through the testimony of those who first received it, the prophets and apostles. What we have in the Bible is not the direct testimony of these prophets and apostles, but the first written deposit of their testimony to the revelation. And this acknowledges that, like Moses didn't write all the books of Moses. It's unlikely that Moses wrote the story of his own death. These stories were passed along, were circulated in community, were written down later. So there's a couple steps removed, which is not to say that there wasn't a lot of attention paid to keeping things exactly the way that they should be. It's just acknowledging, like, the Bible's not an instruction manual that God wrote by hand. It's mediated. I know there will be pushback to this, but follow along. Stick with me. It says, thus, the text of the Bible is not the ultimate norm of theology. It is, however, the primary formal norm, and it mediates the ultimate norm to us. So while revelation is the standard, we don't have the revelation. We have the stories of the revelation in the Bible. So while the Bible is not the Word, it's the only record that we have of the Word, so it's the best thing we got. Therefore, the testimony of the Bible, rather than the other norms mentioned above, namely biblical inerrancy, infallible pronouncements of church officials, Christian experience, or what is known as the Vincentian canon of universality, which derives its name from a 5th century monk named Vincent, who defined Catholic faith as what has been believed everywhere, always, and by all. So what he's saying is that the fact that certain beliefs are accepted means that they are the norm. And these authors are saying the proper norm of theology is the revelation of God. We don't have the revelation of God. The next best thing we have to the revelation of God is the testimony of the Bible. Therefore, that is the proper norm above all these other things. What the church says, Christian experience, what everybody believes. It says, why is the Bible the highest court of appeal in theology? God's revelation must be received by human persons in order to be revelation. Otherwise, it's just hanging out there. So the reception of revelation completes the event of revelation. It's like saying the food isn't food until you eat it. It says, we do not have the original testimony of the first receivers, which was mostly oral. But we do have in the Bible the first written deposit of this original testimony, which thus becomes the means or basis of all later dependent revelation. QED, whatever that means. So, we're testing everything. We're looking at everything. We're looking at what's behind everything. But all with the acknowledgement that this written deposit that we have, even though it's mediated by humans and passed along in oral tradition and written down, is still the purest source that we have of the original revelation. Therefore, is of extreme value that it may not be the word, the logos, but it's the closest thing we got. And with that, I'll say thank you for hanging with me through all this. And we'll see you next time as we continue to figure out what is the gospel. Thanks, and God bless. Thank you for listening to Faith Still Seeking, a program about Christian theology. No certainty required. Please see the show notes for more information about the images, writings, and music that went into making this episode, and for more about the artists who created them. For more information about my work and about how to support it, visit my website at kellywilson.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. God bless.